Thank you for the invitation to speak. I think that when it comes to the climate crisis, it's something that young people particularly feel really strongly about, and it's of great importance to our generation. And I think that's something we've seen over the past few years, that it's something that young people really mobilize around, and they put lots of time and effort into campaigning on this matter. So it's really great to have somewhere like Mock COP26 platformed an event like this. So thank you so much for that opportunity. Um, Last year, Mock COP26 came to fill the void left by the postponement of COP26. It was supposed to happen last November, but because of the coronavirus pandemic, it was postponed on the grounds of safety, sensibly so. Um, and so Mock COP26 was really young people illustrating what would be different, what would happen if young people were the delegations that represented their country. What if we were the decision makers and we made a seat at our own table? So it was an event that happened November, December 2020, and we had over 400 volunteers supporting with the running of this 2 week event. And the actual event itself was only planned in the space of 3 months. It was only in September that we properly started. So I think it's a really impressive feat that young people were able to self-organize a conference in the space of 3 months that brought together over 330 different delegations, different delegates representing over 140 UN member states. So it was a really great atmosphere to be at in that conference. I think some of the differences were that it was youth led, and it was youth delivered, and it was youth represented. And part of that meant that the conversations we had at that event were slightly different. We covered more themes than a traditional COP26 or COP25 or previous COPs would have done. And those 6 themes that we had were climate education, climate justice, health and well-being, climate resilient livelihoods, which included green jobs and retraining, NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that countries make to try and reduce their carbon emissions and bring it in line with Paris's 1.5-degree target, and biodiversity. And not all of those themes are covered in traditional climate summits and climate conferences. And I think that was something that made it really important that we made that stage for ourselves to come up with the conversations that we wanted to have. It was a 2 week event, like I've said before, and that first week was really centered around reskilling and providing a place for people to learn about the climate crisis, for them to hear from experts, to hear from each other, and to have panel discussions to really educate themselves about it, and most importantly, hear about some of the solutions that are possible. I think so often it can be really overwhelming to hear about the climate crisis without them being presented solutions. So that was really what the first week was about. And we were really thrilled to have some really high level and senior people take part in that. And the actual event itself was opened by Alok Sharma, who is the COP26 president and is a member of UK government. So it was really exciting to have him there. The actual statement, the conference itself culminated with a global declaration on behalf of those delegations that attended Mock COP26, 18 ambitious yet realistic policies that are written into a formal treaty that we wrote in accordance with some of the leading environmental lawyers, including some of them from Client Earth, who you might have heard of. And that treaty can be viewed on our website, mockcop.org/treaty. And I'd really recommend a read. They're not treaties in the same way that the Paris Climate Agreement is. They're more broad, and there's interpretation left for different countries to decide what's needed. But those 18 policies are what were decided by those young people that took part. And the actual event itself was closed at the closing ceremony by Nigel Topping, who is the UK's high-level champion as part of the UNFCCC Race to Zero team. And it was really great to have him there and to have his input. The actual conference itself, part of the thing that made it quite remarkable was that 72% of the delegates were from the Global South. And we were really about refocusing the conversation on the areas of the world that are most impacted by climate change, rather than the countries that cause the most to pollute. So really refocusing on it to try and refocus the conversation on the impact climate change has to prompt further action. And 63% of the attendees and delegates of the event were female or non-binary, which again is a really impressive gender balance for negotiations that are typically male-dominated. I think one of the things that we're most proud of was the press coverage we got from the event. We had over 400 articles written across the world, and it had a readership of over 98 million people. And I don't know how they calculate that, but it suggests that 98 million people read an article that included Mock COP26's policies, treaty, or the event. So that's something that we're really excited about. Now we've moved on to phase two. The event itself was November, December last year. The next stage for us is implementation. So COP26 is a really great opportunity to really refocus the conversation. Hopefully by that stage, we'll have started to come out of the coronavirus pandemic, and there'll be a huge need for there to be a green recovery. There'll be loads of financing and funding being channeled by governments into certain areas, and it provides a really great opportunity to refocus that on a green transition and into the green economy to build back from the pandemic in a more green way. So that's something that we're really pushing for. So we're working around the world with all of the campaigners that we've got across the world to push for national governments and UN bodies to try and start implementing these treaties and these policies ahead of COP26. So that's the real focus that we've got at the moment. Then sort of coming back to the local authority side of stuff, lots of the policies that we've got apply to national governments, but there are quite a few that can be done by local authorities. And I think that the main one is about this reaching net zero. We're really keen that that happens in line with the Paris Climate Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. And one of the great ways that that can be done is through Race to Zero. And we were really, really thrilled to have Nigel Topping present in our closing ceremony. So it would seem rude not to mention the amazing work that they're doing. But there's a Race to Zero for cities, where cities and local authorities are able to pledge that they're going to reach net zero by a certain date that they choose, but that's in line with 1.5 degrees. And along with that, there's concrete actions, a declaration of a climate emergency. And lots of that can be done through an organization called C40. But the website for that is citiesracetozero.org. And that provides some great ideas and resources. And I think part of that, if local authorities were going to go through that approach, it would be really great to have young people involved. I think Mock COP26 has shown the demand that young people have to engage in policy and do more than just protest and strike, but to actually be involved in policy and decision making. And I think involving young people in that, in local authorities, on a local level will be really important for trying to have success with this and get public support. It is, after all, young people who will be the next voting generation and will be those people who will be either implementing or living with the changes being proposed now. So it would be a really great continuity method to engage young people right now. And by having youth engagement plans and platforms for young people to contribute their ideas in a concrete way so that they know what's happening with those suggestions going forward and they can feel listened to, will be a really great strategy for local authorities to use.
Thank you for that, Josh. I just want to talk a little bit about the differences between the mock COP and the actual COPs that we've had in the past and we will have later this year. And you spoke about the difference of attendees, very struck by the number of attendees you had from the Southern Hemisphere in particular. But how would you say those differences should inspire the people who are attending the actual COP in November?
Yeah, I think some of the key differences that we had was that larger representation from the global south, refocusing that conversation on the impact that climate change has. One of the other changes we made sure that the event didn't clash with religious festivals or culturally significant days. We'd actually moved the event from when COP26 would have happened to a few weeks later, so we didn't clash with Diwali. So I think having those sorts of understandings of what days might be a barrier to people engaging with it is really important. And by having so many people and refocusing that conversation on the impacts of climate change, it really helped to promote strong action. Learning about the catastrophic and devastating impact that it has on people's lives and livelihoods was a great incentive for people to actually be more ambitious. And there are so many great ideas and methods of activism and campaigning that do occur on the front line of the climate crisis that we just don't hear about. And so by doing that, it was really great. And I think also having time in advance online, that's something that I'm sure COP26 leads to doing at the moment in the run up to the event. But by doing that, it meant that we were able to reduce our carbon emissions considerably. A traditional COP has got over 55,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, whereas our event was 14 tonnes. So the equivalent comparison there is massive. So there are huge savings when it comes to carbon that can be made by having aspects of events online.
Can I remind our attendees to use the Q&A function to send in questions to Josh? But I mean, I'm really struck by the differences and you've got in the attendees there compared to the actual one. And it seems to me that a big theme of the mock COP is it empowers the powerless, or those who have traditionally been relatively powerless on a world stage. I mean, did you see that as well? And is that something you really urge um, the um, the world leaders to bear in mind?
Yeah, definitely. And I think so we've recently had the G7 and the G20 will be happening later this year. There's loads of platforms for countries that are in G7 and are in G20 to have these international conversations within their own groups. So part of the thing that's so great about COP26 and other COPs is that it really is international. So I think it would be really important, given that there are already all of these meetings that happen between countries in the G20, to make sure that those countries' voices don't come on top of everybody else's, and that you make space to listen to others. Um, by One of the things that we did was to weight voting. So delegations from countries that are most affected by climate change had more of a vote when it came to proceedings than those who don't. And part of that was to sort of reallocate the injustice that some countries contribute loads and loads to climate change. The UK has got a relatively high carbon footprint compared to some of the world. It's not the highest in the world, but it's relatively high. But we don't feel the impacts of climate change to the same extent. We don't have natural disasters, hurricanes, tsunamis, or considerable sea level rise. But other countries do, and they don't pollute as anywhere near as much as the UK. So reallocating not only the conversation, but the weight of voting was something that I think should have serious consideration at looking at ensuring that it's a just transition and includes more than just technical details on carbon policy, but covers more humanitarian issues.
World leaders are all very much of an age as well. So the age profile of the decision makers at Mock COP was very different to what it will be in Glasgow this November. Why is it that the participation of younger people is so important in this agenda?
I think there's a number of reasons. The first that I would say is that it's something that young people want to be involved in, and there's that energy and that ambition to be involved in it. So it's a captive audience. It wouldn't take very much to engage them because they already want to be engaged. Like my generation want to be part of this. I think from a sort of practical and logistical point of view, our generation will be the next leaders. We're going to be moving into like sort of inherit the systems that we already have, and then it'll be up to us to sort of change it and go along with them. So by including us in this early stage, it makes that transition easier. It makes it easier for young people to go into politics, to go into leadership. So from that point of view, I think that's another benefit. But also the ambition. I think young people show more ambition when it comes to this because they use social media more. They're sometimes more up to date with events that are happening on the other side of the world that aren't often always in the news. We sometimes hear about natural disasters and then a short while after we don't, but the impact of that is ongoing. And I think young people are often more up to date with the impact that has through social networking sites and through having communication with people on other parts of the world. So they almost have more personable reasons to want to push for some of this stuff.
Now, the similar argument applies in local politics as well. And bear in mind, our audience for this event is council officers and councillors, and council chambers in particular have quite a senior age profile, it's fair to say. And I think a lot of organisations do struggle to engage with their younger population. And we do have a question here from Ben Plummer, who says, what are the best ways to engage and involve young people in the work local authorities do to tackle climate change? What sort of engagement methods do you think would be the most effective?
Yeah, I think giving young people a method to directly input is really important. We see quite a lot that we have things like youth councils, but what gets decided and suggested those youth councils doesn't often have a direct link to what the grown-ups and the adults are doing in their proper councils or their decisions. So I think making sure that there's a tangible link between what young people are asking for in youth councils or in youth outreach programs and then what actually gets talked about to make sure that that link is there to really make sure that young people feel involved and engaged. Um, I think often trying to understand what young people want and then making it clear that that's being acted on is a really great way to engage them. So maybe keeping a website or social media feed up to date with what the council is doing or what the local authority is doing. I think for lots of people my age don't understand what local authorities do to the same extent that they understand what a national government does or a UN. Well, actually, UN bodies are quite confusing often, but it's sometimes harder to understand what a local authority does. So trying to make that really clear, I think, will engage people more because they feel like they'll understand it and can feed into it more.
That's quite an interesting point. That's actually because it's certainly not only younger people who struggle to correctly point out what exact roles are of a council. So clarifying that would be a useful thing. But how can they actually engage with you? I mean, would it be helpful if they actually proactively, attended schools to discuss their work, the social media? I mean, what things stand out for you as the best way to actually converse with younger people beyond the youth councils?
Yeah, I think putting young people with the decision makers and having that intergenerational dialogue is really important. I think quite often youth outreach can be sort of pigeonholed into one section. You have all of the young people talking, and then you have the proper meeting that happens. And I think merging the two together and having young people present at the proper meeting in order to talk with the decision makers can be quite empowering for young people and make the transfer of information quicker. It means that somebody doesn't have to paraphrase what a young person said to bring it to the meeting. Um, and sometimes that might get miscommunicated. So bringing them directly in to observe and then be able to make comments and to input into the actual meetings could be really beneficial for that. And I think school outreach could have a place in that to try and engage young people with what goes on in council and local authorities so that they know how best they can input, and then to also advertise some of these opportunities to try and feed in through youth councils and through attending some of these intergenerational dialogues.
When you speak around with your colleagues and friends, do you get any sense that anyone understands the role of local government and how it can be a useful tool in these areas?
Um, I think it is something that could do with being improved upon. I think there is quite a lot of misconception and confusion about the actual role that a local authority has. Um, so yeah, I'd say that that is something that could be improved on. Although there are certain ideas that people seem to think work universally. So a declaration of a climate emergency, for example, is a powerful statement from any leader of at any level, whether that is a small parish council, a large local authority, or a national government. A declaration of a climate emergency is a powerful tool for not only stating that that's something that's important to that area, but also for just raising the profile of that.
Now, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, which is that there's a lot of debate in society right now about young versus old, and sometimes the word woke comes up. Um, do you feel that this is? Do you feel you're part of a generational war, or is that a construct of the media? And is that something that you find offensive? How or unhelpful? I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I don't think it's helpful to make comparisons between young and old. I think progress is made when we all work together, and so creating divides is never helpful. It makes it harder to make progress, harder to understand each other. And if we sort of make it a them and us, which does happen in a lot of youth activism, there's almost like a young people against the grown-ups. It's not helpful, and it creates divides that make it harder to have constructive input and understanding and collective responsibility. So I think it's really important that these conversations are intergenerational and it doesn't become young versus old, it becomes young and old working together. So I think that's what I would say, is that it's not always helpful to make those comparisons, and we're all guilty of that. Lots of young people do it. I think I've probably done it in the past of like, oh, I wish older people took things more seriously or something. But to say like actually we all need to be in this together and work together on it.
And it's very easy to generalize that young people think um, and it's very difficult to gauge the overall viewpoints of generation, and there's very disparate views in all generations. But do you really see that? Just going back to the idea of youth parliaments, youth councils, and that sort of thing. I mean, is that a way of actually getting that element of democratic accountability in there, and really getting a fair representation of the views of your generation as it is for all generations?
Um, I think so. I think that if people are elected, then it sort of it helps to make sure that that is representative, that those viewpoints are representative. I think it would be fair to say though that young people are the environment is something they care deeply about. There are a lot of surveys that talk about that. For example, only 4% of students in education in the UK, according to a survey from Students Organising for Sustainability, felt that they knew a lot about climate change, and 68% wanted to learn more. And I think that wanting to learn more is a sign that it is something that they care about. And I think we've seen from other national surveys that when you look at age demographics, the younger you get, the more the population want to have action, and this is something that they care about. I think for me, the issue with lots of youth councils is that the notions they can stand on are often quite limited, and the ability for them to meaningfully impact real life decisions isn't there. It's like you have your youth council and you can only stand on something like we'll reduce plastic in a school canteen, or we'll do policy that directly affects young people rather than then policy that affects everybody, which includes young people. So sometimes it can often feel quite siloed into you can only pick from a small number of policies and you can't stand on I want to have more green and then everything. It has to be directly linked to young people. So I think that's sometimes a problem with them. But the idea of a democratic system would seem very sensible.
So would you like an input into the most difficult and some of the gravest decisions that councils make, for instance, in terms of the budget process and the biggest decisions? And you're saying that a lot more, quite often it is just some of the smaller, the easier decisions in which young people's views are considered.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. In school, we have youth like young MP systems, and often when you stand for that, it has to be something that links to your school. People might go for a sort of anti-bullying campaign, an inclusivity campaign, reduction of plastic, single-use plastic, and the same seems to happen with local authorities and councils. So yes, I think it would be great for young people to be involved in some of those more difficult decisions and conversations where they can feel like they can properly input into the process and have some responsibility and feel properly listened to.
And I also wanted to ask you about the sort of people that you're personally keen to engage with. And there's lots of discussion at the moment about how people are unwilling to speak with people of certain parties, of certain viewpoints. It's not a very inclusive mindset. What's your message about who you're willing to speak with on these issues?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I personally would say that I was willing to speak to anybody who was willing to be spoken to. I think quite often, in some of the activism I've done, we've sent requests blanketly, and lots of people have got back and said no. So actually, sometimes we're limited to who we can speak to based on who says that they're willing to. Um, and I think that is definitely a conversation that happens within youth activism, and I think activism in general. That there are certain people that groups say actually we won't talk with, and whether that's right or wrong, I suppose is up to the context of that group and the person they're wanting to speak to make sure that everybody feels able to be at that meeting and to feel listened to and included. But I don't think it's helpful to just say, oh, I'm not working with ... Because if that person ended up in power and you've said you're not working with them, there's no way that you can have any constructive conversation with them.
And quite often, a lot of activists, it is the Conservative Party which feels the ire of lots of activists. And you'd say, yes, I'd be very happy to work with a Conservative council, a Labour council, any council.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I think that just about rounds up that session. So it's been a pleasure to have you with us, Josh. It's a really powerful speech, and really grateful for your input today. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.